The afternoon sunlight slanted lazily through the narrow street, warming the worn bricks and the quiet hum of suburban life. I was carrying a small package down the walkway when I first noticed her. She was standing by the window of the house next door, a silhouette framed by cream-colored curtains that danced lightly in the breeze. Something about the way she held herself, shoulders relaxed, chin slightly lifted, made her presence undeniable. She wasn't trying to be noticed, she simply was. Her hair, dark with streaks of silver that shimmered in the sun, fell loosely around her shoulders, catching the light with every subtle movement. She glanced at me, and, just for a moment, the world seemed to narrow to the space between her gaze and mine. Then, slowly, she smiled. Not a casual, polite smile, but one that felt deliberate, knowing, like she had been expecting me all along. My chest tightened, a strange mixture of excitement and hesitation. I paused, package in hand, suddenly aware of the flutter of nerves in my stomach. The air smelled faintly of jasmine from a nearby garden, mingling with the warm scent of sun-heated bricks. I noticed how her fingers lightly traced the edge of the curtain, delicate and purposeful, as if the small gesture itself carried meaning I couldn't yet understand. There was a quiet elegance to her movements, each one controlled but effortlessly graceful. For a moment, I caught myself imagining stepping closer, drawn by the silent invitation in her eyes. She tilted her head slightly, and the sunlight caught the glint of something, perhaps mischief, in her gaze. Then, in a voice soft and almost teasing, she said the words that would linger in my mind. "Do you dare step inside?" I froze, uncertain whether to laugh, respond, or retreat. My rational mind shouted cautions. This was a neighbor I barely knew. She was older, and there were social boundaries I wasn't supposed to cross. Yet the warmth of her smile, the gentle curve of her lips, and the quiet steadiness in her eyes tugged at something deeper. A part of me that yearned for connection, for intimacy, for a touch of something thrilling in the predictable rhythm of my day, urged me forward. She took a subtle step back, hands resting lightly against the windowsill, giving me space, yet holding the moment between us in a delicate tension. I noticed, almost involuntarily, the soft sway of her dress and the glimmer of a bracelet catching the sun with every tiny movement. It was as if the world had slowed, the usual noises of the street fading, leaving only the sound of my own heartbeat and the quiet hum of anticipation. I nodded, almost imperceptibly, unsure whether it was consent, agreement, or merely acknowledgement of the silent conversation we'd begun. Her smile widened, approving, and I felt a strange mix of nervousness and exhilaration. This was the first step, a fleeting moment suspended in time, but I knew, with an unspoken certainty, that nothing about the days ahead would feel ordinary again. A few days later, I found myself standing in front of her door, heart thudding with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The package I delivered last week had been minor, a book she had ordered, but she had insisted I come inside to exchange a few thoughts about it. I reminded myself to keep my composure, yet my palms were damp, and the faint scent of cologne I wore seemed cloying in the nervous silence. The door opened before I could knock. She stood there, framed by the soft interior light, her hair tucked casually behind one ear. The way she looked at me now, not with the playful teasing of our first encounter, but with quiet attentiveness, made my pulse stutter. She was wearing a simple, elegant dress that hinted at the curve of her waist, yet nothing felt provocative. Everything about her radiated calm, warmth, and understated confidence. "Come in," she said, her voice gentle, almost conspiratorial. She stepped aside, and I crossed the threshold, acutely aware of the faint, inviting scent of jasmine mixed with the earthy warmth of her living room. The space was cozy but refined, soft light spilling from a table lamp, books neatly stacked, a vase of fresh flowers on the counter. It felt lived in, personal, and somehow entirely hers. We lingered in the entryway for a moment, exchanging a glance that conveyed far more than words could. Then she led me toward the small kitchen, where a kettle was already beginning to hum on the stove. "Tea?" she asked, her hand brushing mine as she gestured toward the counter. The contact was fleeting, just enough for a spark of warmth to shoot up my arm. My fingers tingled, and I found myself suddenly aware of how close I was standing to her. As she prepared the tea, I allowed myself to notice the little details, the soft movement of her fingers, the delicate clink of the teacup against the saucer, the gentle arch of her back as she reached for a jar of sugar. When she handed me the cup, our hands met briefly. Her touch lingered just slightly longer than necessary, and the warmth of her palm against mine seemed to echo the quiet pull I had felt outside her window days before. We moved to the small sitting area by the window. I took a seat across from her, and for a few moments, neither of us spoke. The sunlight streamed in, brushing across her face, highlighting the subtle lines that hinted at her life experience. When she finally smiled, it was a private smile, meant just for me, and I felt an odd combination of ease and anticipation. We began to talk, first about the book, then about life in general. She listened with intent, her eyes never leaving mine, occasionally brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. There was a rhythm to our conversation, a quiet dance of exchange and understanding, punctuated by laughter that felt genuine and unhurried. Each glance, each small gesture, felt carefully measured but undeniably intimate. When I finally left, the sun had dipped lower, painting the sky in warm, golden hues. I walked back to my apartment with a lingering warmth in my chest, replaying every small detail, the brush of her hand, the tilt of her head, the steady cadence of her voice. The invitation had been simple, almost innocent, yet it had opened a door, not just to her home, but to something far more unexpected, a quiet, simmering connection that I couldn't ignore. A week passed, and our interactions had grown into a tentative rhythm. That afternoon, I found myself stepping across the threshold of her living room once again, feeling the familiar warmth of her home settle around me like a gentle embrace. The air smelled of freshly brewed tea and faint lavender, a comforting combination that seemed to ground me instantly. She was seated near the window, sunlight brushing her hair with a golden glow, and she looked up as I entered, her smile soft but knowing. "Sit," she said simply, patting the seat across from her. I obeyed, suddenly conscious of the small space between us. Our eyes met, lingering slightly longer than necessary, and I felt an odd thrill at the unspoken attention. There was no hurry, no expectation, just the quiet intimacy of shared presence. We began to talk, not about trivialities, but about life, about the subtle regrets and quiet victories that had shaped us. She spoke gently of her late husband, her voice tinged with nostalgia and a hint of sorrow that didn't seek sympathy but shared understanding. I listened, captivated by the honesty in her tone, the way her fingers absently traced the edge of her teacup as she spoke. There was vulnerability there, but also a quiet strength, a grace in how she carried her memories without bitterness. Encouraged by her openness, I told her a story from my own life, a failure that had left me unsure of my path. The words felt heavier as I spoke, yet lighter when I saw her nod in understanding, her eyes soft and attentive. She didn't offer solutions or cliches. She simply listened, her presence steady, comforting, reassuring. When I glanced down, I noticed her hand resting near mine, the tips of her fingers brushing against the fabric of the chair. I wanted to reach out, to let the warmth of her hand anchor me, but I hesitated, letting the tension hover between us, delicate and charged. Time seemed to bend around us. The sunlight faded to a warm amber, casting a soft glow across her living room. The shadows highlighted the gentle curve of her smile, the faint laugh lines around her eyes, the subtle strength in the way she held herself. Every detail drew me in, made the space between us feel smaller, more intimate, even though no one had crossed a boundary. At one point, she leaned back slightly, her shoulder brushing mine as she shifted, and I felt a shiver of awareness. It was a small contact, almost accidental, yet it carried a weight that neither of us spoke aloud. Her presence was grounding, comforting, and electric all at once. In that quiet moment, I realized that this wasn't about physical attraction alone. It was about connection, the kind that left you both exposed and secure at the same time. When I finally rose to leave, the air had cooled, and the evening light deepened the shadows in her home. We lingered at the doorway, a subtle hesitation in our movements, a shared acknowledgement that something unspoken had begun to blossom between us. Her smile followed me down the walkway, warm and private, and I walked back to my apartment feeling a strange mix of longing and peace, aware that our quiet moments together had already begun to change me in ways I couldn't yet name. It was a quiet Saturday morning when I spotted her across the street at the small cafe she favored. The sunlight dappled through the trees, casting moving patterns on the pavement, and she was seated at a corner table, a steaming cup of coffee cradled in her hands. Her posture was relaxed but precise, every movement imbued with a quiet elegance. The way she held the cup, fingers brushing against the rim, thumb resting lightly on the handle, was mesmerizing, intimate in its simplicity. When our eyes met, I felt the familiar tug in my chest, the pulse of something both thrilling and forbidden. She gave me a small, almost imperceptible smile, the kind that suggested she had noticed me noticing her. I wanted to look away, to act casual, but something about the warmth in her gaze rooted me in place. There was a playful spark there, as if she were daring me, silently asking how far I would let my curiosity and desire carry me. I walked over, keeping my steps measured, trying to appear composed while my heart betrayed me with every beat. As I approached, she tilted her head slightly, a strand of hair falling across her cheek. Her fingers reached up to tuck it behind her ear, brushing against her face in a gesture so natural, yet so captivating that I felt the world narrow around us. Every detail, the scent of her perfume, faintly floral and comforting, the gentle curve of her lips, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled, pulled me closer, emotionally if not physically. We exchanged casual greetings, the kind that masked the underlying tension neither of us wanted to name. Yet as we spoke, our words seemed secondary to the way we looked at each other. Every pause, every shift of weight, every brush of her hand against the table was amplified in significance. When she laughed softly at something I said, her fingers lightly brushed my arm, deliberate yet fleeting. That small contact sent a shiver up my spine, and I realized how much I craved the intimacy of these understated gestures. We lingered longer than either of us intended. At one point, she leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table, her eyes locking with mine. The sunlight caught the highlights in her hair, framing her face in a warm glow. For a heartbeat, neither of us spoke, and yet the air between us vibrated with unspoken acknowledgement. I could sense her awareness of the age difference, of the social boundaries that hovered around us, and yet there was no hesitation in the way she engaged me, no shame, only curiosity and a quiet invitation to step closer emotionally. When I finally rose to leave, our hands brushed as I tucked my phone into my pocket, a contact that lingered just a fraction too long. She watched me with a smile that was both approving and challenging, as if daring me to return, to continue the slow dance we had begun. I walked away feeling the pull of her presence behind me, the echo of her gaze burning softly in my chest. That day, I realized that the longing between us was no longer subtle. It had begun to assert itself, quietly, insistently, and irresistibly. A quiet Sunday afternoon found me once again at her doorstep, carrying a small toolbox. She had called earlier, mentioning a loose cabinet hinge that needed fixing. A trivial task, yet an excuse for me to be near her, to share a space that felt increasingly intimate. When the door opened, she stood framed by soft sunlight filtering through the curtains, wearing a comfortable, flowing blouse and jeans. She greeted me with a smile that made my chest tighten in that familiar way. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. Her voice carried the warmth of someone who knew they had my full attention. As I entered, I became acutely aware of the subtle details of her home. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the faint scent of vanilla and aged wood, the cozy arrangement of chairs and cushions. It was lived in yet refined, a space that reflected both her independence and her warmth. We moved to the kitchen, where she directed me toward the cabinet. I knelt on the floor, fiddling with the hinge, while she leaned nearby, sipping a cup of tea. Every small gesture she made, reaching for a napkin, adjusting her posture, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, felt amplified in its intimacy. Her presence was steady, grounding, yet electric, each movement carrying an unspoken attention toward me. At one point, she crouched down beside me to hand me a screwdriver, our shoulders brushing lightly. The contact was brief, accidental, yet I felt a spark, a warmth that traveled through me unexpectedly. I caught her glance, subtle but lingering, and the quiet rhythm of our shared space seemed to deepen. There was no rush, no urgency, only the comforting closeness of being together, engaged in a task that felt ordinary, yet charged with an almost imperceptible tension. As I worked, she offered gentle suggestions, her voice soft but confident, each word carrying a reassuring weight. When I straightened, she leaned forward slightly to inspect my work, and our hands collided lightly on the cabinet door. Neither of us moved away immediately. The brush of her palm against mine lingered longer than necessary, and I felt the electric hum of awareness between us. I was hyper-conscious of her presence, the warmth of her body nearby, the subtle scent of her perfume, the way her hair fell across her shoulder in a golden cascade from the sunlight. When the repair was done, she smiled, a quiet, private smile that seemed to acknowledge the shared intimacy of the moment. We lingered in the kitchen, moving around each other naturally, close enough for contact, yet careful not to overstep. Every touch, her hand brushing mine, the gentle shift of her elbow against my side, felt deliberate, electric, and safe all at once. By the time I left, the sun had begun to dip, painting the room in warm amber tones. I walked away with a sense of fulfillment and anticipation, aware that our interactions had evolved beyond casual neighborly help. Shared spaces had become a vessel for intimacy, for subtle gestures and quiet electricity. And in that space, I realized that every glance, every brush of skin, every shared laugh was drawing us closer, quietly, inexorably, towards something neither of us could fully name yet. It started as a light drizzle, the kind that drifts lazily through the streets, turning the pavement into a slick mirror of the gray sky above. I had been walking home when I noticed her on her porch, glancing at the clouds as if calculating how long before the rain fell in earnest. She caught sight of me and waved, a small, familiar gesture, and I quickened my pace. By the time I reached her, the rain had begun to fall in gentle, persistent sheets. She handed me a large umbrella, her fingers brushing mine as I took it. The contact was brief, but the warmth of her skin lingered far longer in my mind. I offered to share the walk with her, knowing it would be just a few steps down the street to where the rain softened enough to be bearable. She agreed, and we moved together, the umbrella held between us. The space under the umbrella was small, intimate. I was acutely aware of the warmth radiating from her shoulder brushing mine, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the fresh, earthy smell of rain. Our conversation started lightly, comments on the weather, a joke about soggy shoes, but the words soon fell away, replaced by a quiet awareness, a shared understanding that something unspoken was hovering between us. Then, unexpectedly, she stopped. Rain slid down the umbrella, dripping onto the pavement, and she looked up at me, her eyes searching. There was a vulnerability there, subtle but undeniable, the kind that made me want to lean closer, to close the distance between us in ways words could never achieve. She began, hesitating. I didn't expect this. Her voice was soft, almost unsure, but it carried a weight that settled heavily in my chest. I took a tentative step closer, careful yet drawn to her in ways I could no longer deny. I didn't either, I admitted. The words sounded small, inadequate, but they were honest. Our eyes locked, and in that gaze, the world seemed to shrink until only the two of us existed. Rain falling softly around us, the hum of distant traffic muted by the storm. Her hand brushed mine again, this time lingering longer, fingertips tracing a line up my palm almost imperceptibly. I felt the warmth of her skin, the steady rhythm of her pulse, and it anchored me. I feel something, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. I swallowed, emotions knotting in my throat, and whispered back, I do too. We stood there, under the umbrella, neither of us moving, letting the silence speak the words we hadn't dared to say before. The rain, the closeness, the subtle warmth of shared space, it all built into a moment of truth. No rushed gestures, no dramatic confessions, only the quiet acknowledgement of what had been growing between us. Desire, respect, and an emotional intimacy that neither of us could ignore. As the rain eased, we finally moved, walking slowly toward her porch. Every step was deliberate, each brush of hands and shoulders a testament to the unspoken connection. That night, the storm outside mirrored the tempest within us, yet in its wake, there was a clarity. We had admitted it, even if quietly, and nothing would be the same again. The following evening, the air was cool and soft, carrying the faint scent of rain-soaked earth. I found myself once again at her door, a small, wrapped loaf of bread in hand, a peace offering, though neither of us would have called it that. She opened the door with that familiar, knowing smile, the kind that made the world feel a little smaller, a little safer. Her hair was loosely pinned back, and her eyes crinkled in delight when she saw me, a warmth spreading through me that went far beyond the mundane pleasure of being welcomed inside. "Come in," she said, her voice soft but deliberate. I stepped over the threshold and felt the familiar embrace of her home. The muted glow of lamps, the quiet hum of a kettle on the stove, the faint floral scent of candles she must have lit earlier. The comfort of it was immediate, yet I was aware of something new, a closeness that had been quietly building over weeks, now fully present, unspoken but undeniable. We settled in her living room, a blanket draped across the back of the sofa. She gestured toward it, and I sat beside her, close enough that our shoulders brushed lightly. The contact was casual, but the warmth that radiated from her made my chest tighten in the most agreeable way. We laughed softly over trivial things, misremembered stories, small jokes about my clumsy handling of her kitchen tools, but each laugh carried a deeper resonance, a shared intimacy that needed no words. As the evening darkened, we grew quieter, letting the soft sounds of the city outside filter through the open window. I noticed the subtle way she leaned slightly toward me, her fingers brushing against mine when she reached for the teacup. My own hand lingered near hers, not quite touching, yet close enough to feel the electricity in the space between us. I could hear the steady rhythm of her breathing, the gentle warmth radiating through her body, and I realized that all the hesitation, all the unspoken tension, had finally transformed into something tender and secure. At one point, she reached over and tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear. The motion was small, intimate, and entirely natural. Her eyes met mine, soft and confident, and in that gaze, I felt an affirmation, acceptance, trust, and a quiet joy in the shared vulnerability that had grown between us. There was no rush, no urgency, just the warmth of two people who had learned to inhabit the same emotional space with care and devotion. I rested my head slightly toward hers, feeling the reassuring weight of her shoulder against mine. She smiled, resting her cheek lightly on my temple, and I felt the steady beat of her heart, a quiet, rhythmic confirmation that we were here, together, in this moment. The warmth, the laughter, the lingering touches, the unspoken affection, they all converged into a sense of completeness, a gentle resolution to the slow burn that had carried us from curiosity to intimacy. When I finally stood to leave, there was no awkward pause, no hesitancy. She walked me to the door, our hands brushing briefly, a simple gesture heavy with meaning. Outside, the night was calm, the air fresh from the earlier rain. I walked back to my apartment with a sense of contentment I had never known before, a quiet certainty that, regardless of the world outside, we had found something lasting, tender, and profoundly ours.